Right, back live with you tonight here on In Focus, and thanks for staying on. The DA believes Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan is passing the buck on Eskom's multi-challenges. It follows his appearance before the public accounts watchdog Scopa in the morning. The official opposition says it's bewildered to observe persistent evasiveness among senior government officers. For more on this, we're joined now by DA Member of Parliament, Benedicta van Minnen. Good to have you, Benedicta, and thank you very much for your time. And the Minister would say, well, I mean, I was not before a court of law. He made it very clear that the audi partarum principle doesn't apply to him. But he says he's been doing, certainly from where he is sitting, all that which he needs to do as the shareholder in responding to some of the issues where evidence has been provided to him. What do you say?
Well, he's correct. He is a statutory shareholder. He is also the minister in charge of state-owned enterprises. And it is deeply concerning that what we're seeing is a very, very reluctant attitude to take positive action, and an even more reluctant attitude to actually hold people like the board to account. So in the last few weeks, I mean, we haven't just had interviews with under a narrator. And I must also point out that Scopa has, for the last 4 years, been working with Eskom, but also with the board, with the SIU, with the Hawks, and with SAPS. And quite honestly, nobody wants to take ownership of the allegations that are being made. And everybody is finger-pointing, and nobody wants to actually investigate very, very real issues that are being raised and allegations that are being made that are very, very serious. Yeah. And that is concerning. And ultimately, you know, as the minister said today, when you're in charge, and the buck stops with you. Well, that applies to him as well.
Do you think, I mean, it's a justified expectation, I suppose, on the part of the committee, but on the part of society as well, to say, well, here are allegations that were raised. We can talk about how that report came about and maybe investigate also who gave the order for that report, certainly to be pursued in the way that it has been. But is it a justified expectation to say, we expect now the police to go ahead and investigate, and the police are saying, well, there's really no evidence, so we don't investigate when there is no evidence. At what point do they actually go about investigating?
Well, you know, the thing is that we've been working now with Eskom for 4 years. That's before Andre de Ruyter actually even became the CEO. There have been numerous issues that have been raised. The SIU has, in fact, put a lot of work into doing their side of things. We have been monitoring the criminal charges that have been brought by Eskom. We have been monitoring the internal disciplinaries. There is certainly evidence that needs to be investigated. And last week when we met with the Hawks and with SAPS, there was a complete lack of interest in actually pursuing everything. And instead excuses were raised like, well, you know, he didn't actually submit it in the proper format, or, you know, the interviews didn't actually happen the way we wanted it to happen. And then when one started examining it very closely as to when meetings happened, for example, in June last year and July last year, the head of the Hawks was forced to admit that that did happen. The police commissioner was forced to admit that interactions did happen. And there's really no real answer as to why we're not seeing better investigation into these allegations, and that is concerning. They can't, you know, the police are not in a position to say it holds no merit if they haven't investigated. They can't say it holds no merit if they're raising excuses as to the fact that the T's haven't necessarily been crossed and the I's haven't been dotted. It's their job to investigate allegations. And there seems to be a great reluctance to do so unless the entire matter is tied up with a ribbon and presented to them as a perfect gift. And that is very, very worrying about our law enforcement agencies.
The minister says he doesn't know whether it's a report, it's a couple of reports, or what kind of format they come in. But he says as far as he is concerned, he was shown a diagram with a couple of people connecting them to all sorts of syndicates and whatever else. And he certainly feels that was not enough information for him to go and even ask his colleagues who are said to have been named in that particular diagram to say, What do you know about this? Is that enough from a minister?
Well, remember, he is not a police officer, as he says he's not on trial, but he is the politically responsible entity. And one would certainly think that in a cabinet that he sits in, he would be making inquiries. You would think that natural curiosity would ensure that he would investigate this. There is also a lot of allegation going around that he did not necessarily refute, that he was told of the names, that he in the past has possibly been involved with conversations with people like the National Security Advisor, who we are talking to next week, Mr. Sidney Mufamadi, about the fact that, well, they were going to find out at some point, comments like that. So certainly to now sit back and say, well, actually it's just allegations, I'm not going to investigate that, is politically irresponsible. And what we're seeing with Eskom now is 14, 15 more, 24 years of irresponsible political action and political decisions. So there is definitely an onus on the minister, the cabinet, and on the government to really get to the bottom of ongoing allegations over many years with Eskom.
Yeah. Now, I've heard some saying the questioning by the MPs at Scopa and just this general inquiry has not been forward-looking, has been looking back at what happened and what could have happened then when we are in a situation where we are in the dark right now in stage 6 load shedding, and we want to find answers going forward as to what is going to be done. But for somebody who is thinking that way, how helpful was this process of Scopa, and certainly is the process that is going to be pursued going forward, of finding out what happened in the past, and particularly in the tenure of Andre de Ruyter?
Well, remember that Scopa is, in essence, backward-looking. I mean, the mandate of Scopa is to look at financial records, to look at annual reports, to see what is going on, particularly with financial spend. That is the particular mandate that Scopa has. And then to make recommendations to Parliament. And certainly this, once the ANC, the ruling ANC, some weeks ago, voted down the proposal to have a proper parliamentary investigation into what's happening at Eskom, this was the only option that was left to us. So Scopa, which, as I've said, has now for 4 years been working on the issue of Eskom, is now really looking at what is going on. We're continuing to do so. Next week, we will be having an engagement with Professor Sidney Mufamadi about what he may or may not know. We have discussed things with the board, with the SIU, that's ongoing, with the Hawks. So it's an ongoing process to see what happened in the past, to see why we are where we are now, so we can then make recommendations to Parliament about what needs to happen going forward, so we can really get ourselves out of a situation with Eskom and safeguard security for the future, for the country and for the economy.
Is he concerned enough, you think, for example, even about a critical and important thing as having appointed a CEO at Eskom? He seems to not be in touch. I don't know whether it's because he was in China and therefore has not really kept abreast with the developments as far as the shortlisting and so on and so forth. But does he appear to be committed to that process and really concerned around the urgency of how quickly that needs to happen?
Well, that is a very much a concern that we have, certainly a concern that my party has, that there doesn't appear to be an open process going forward. It seems to be very much happening behind closed doors, and they will be presented with some sort of decision. Again, that is not ideal at all. This is something that has been going on since 1998, when there was a cabinet decision not to invest in maintenance and development with Eskom. That is now catching us. There seems to be a great reluctance to investigate very serious charges of corruption. There seems to be a reluctance to accept that corruption is, in some elements and in some ways, emanating from people connected to the governing party. It's an ongoing pattern that we're seeing. And when we're talking about being in China with, incidentally, the acting CEO of Eskom, when he really should have been here meeting with us with the board, it's very curious to ask why they were also meeting with the Chinese grid company, which is a very large, it's the third largest company in the world, actually, company that deals with electricity in China. Why are they meeting with them, and what are their plans going forward? That's something we should be asking as well.
Is there a sense that you're getting that at least the current board is acting in the interest of the entity and in terms of being leaders of that entity more than just interfering in the management of the utility?
Well, I think the board has really raised very great concerns. When we were talking to the board last week and to the chair of the board and raised the issue of the allegations of two senior political players being involved with corruption and with cabals at Eskom, the chair said straight, it is not the issue of Eskom to be concerned with these allegations because that's not Eskom's business. It is for SAPS to investigate. And he completely refused to take any responsibility for actually looking into the issue or investigating at all. So despite the fact that there was a desire to have an activist board, what we saw last week was a board that was so uninterested in the internal issues with Eskom and with the internal allegations of corruption that, quite honestly, I'm not expecting anything to come from the board.
When all this is happening, quite honestly, Benedicta, the question on many South African minds is, are we going to have electricity in 2 weeks? I mean, do you get that sense? Do you get a sense of people who are actually working towards that? They've got this under control?
No, not at all. I think South Africans are deeply concerned whether or not we're going to have electricity in 2 weeks or in 3 weeks or in a month or during winter. There are now other issues with Kuberg. They are supposed to have been working towards extending their license. Instead, they're not going to meet their targets, which means that even by June next year, in 2024, we're going to have a very serious shortfall. There doesn't appear to be a sense of urgency. And it's more a case, and I mean the board said this to us, that it's the responsibility of South Africans not to use too much electricity. So they're trying to put it onto us, when instead it is Eskom as an entity and the minister and the oversight that is failing to actually assure South Africans that they are taking it seriously and are actually working towards ameliorating the situation.
Yeah. Did you get a surety that they've, I don't know, smoked the peace pipe with the electricity minister and energy minister, that they're actually putting their heads together and working together? Or are they still pulling in opposite directions?
Well, that's difficult to determine, and it fell to a certain extent outside of the scope of what we're investigating today. But it certainly still seems that there are far too many people involved pulling in different directions to actually take us in the direction we need to go to ensure that we have energy security.
Benedicta, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on. That's a DA Member of Parliament, part of the Scopa committee. They're looking at the appearance of Pravin Gordhan today in that committee.